Hey, everybody. It's time once again for another merry adventure into the world of sociology. Woohoo! Well, now that we got that nasty test out of the way, it's time to move on and prepare for the next one. Okay, so today's chapter presentation is on chapter 10 in your sociology text on deviance, one of my personal favorites. And who else to quote under deviance than a guy named Oscar Wilde? He said, morality is simply the attitude we adopt towards people whom we personally dislike. Tallulah the Bankhead said, I am as pure as the driven slush. See, she's not as pure as the driven snow. Never mind. William Shakespeare, remember him? Bard in the Avon, Globe Theatre, England, Romeo, Juliet, Hamlet, nothing, huh? He said, although I am not naturally honest, I am sometimes so by chance. H.L. Mencken said, conscience is that inner voice that warns us someone may be watching. Okay, deviance. The definition appears on page 248, the recognized violation of cultural norms. Deviance can be positive or negative. Excuse me. For example, positive deviance is enthusiastically and shamelessly sucking up to me. Negative would be cheating on a test. It's also pointed out in the text that one's mere existence can be considered deviant without necessarily taking action or making a choice. For example, in my own life, back in the 60s, I made the choice to not cut my hair. See, if you haven't noticed already, your hair just grows naturally. You don't have to do anything about it. It just grows. You have to do something about it to affect the growing, like cut it. And as soon as I let my hair grow, all of a sudden people were threatening me with my very life back in the hippie days. And they would say really awful things to me like, you look just like a girl. And I'd say, well, you don't have a very positive estimation of women now, do you? And I'd say, after all, Jesus had long hair. And they'd say, you're not Jesus. And I go, really? How do you know? Huh? How do you know? Deviance is often equated solely with crime, which is only one of several categories of deviance. So deviance is simply doing that which violates the norms, what is typical. If right now you're not hanging on my every word and just zoning, that's deviance, because you should be hanging on my every word after you just took that first exam and saw the results. Just kidding. Okay, on page 250, you need to know the social foundations of deviance. What are they, Maynard? Thanks for asking. 1, deviance varies according to cultural norms. No thought or action is inherently deviant. Excuse me. Members of all societies are subject to social control, which are attempts by society to regulate the behavior of individuals. Like behavior modification, we receive positive reinforcement for conforming to conventional patterns of thought and behavior, and we receive negative reinforcement when we fail to conform. This gets back to structural functionalism, which says, okay, you got to obey the traditions. Why? Because they work. How do you get people to obey the traditions? You get them pressure to conform. And it's even true today in today's society. There are certain norms that guide society. And as a result, there's pressure on us to conform. And when we don't conform to those, then we receive negative reinforcement. Here's another good person to quote under deviance. His name is Walter C. Reckless. He said, the assumption is that there is a containing external social structure which holds individuals in line, and that there is also an internal buffer which protects people against deviation of the social and legal norms. The second foundation, people become deviant as others define them that way. Society actually shapes the world of good and evil. It's not just a matter of individual choice or personal failings. There are no acts that are everywhere and always deviant. I know the first one that jumps in, well, what about killing? I can give you at least 6 exceptions to killing where it's perfectly okay. like capital punishment, war, self-defense. So how a society defines deviance, who is targeted as deviant, and what people decide to do about nonconformity are all issues of social organization. Now I'll be the first to admit some of my Mark Twain quotes have bombed, but I'm going to go for another. Remember, he was a humorist. He said, "To be good is noble. To tell people how to be good is nobler and much less trouble." Perhaps I should take that out. Hang on. All right. Goodbye, Mark Twain. 3, both norms and the way people define rule breaking involve social power. This is the contribution to the sociology of deviance of the social conflict paradigm. Rules are made to serve the interests of those in power in various social organizations because they make the rules. Similarly, the powerful can break rules without necessarily suffering the same consequences as the less powerful. Okay, so let me give you the following scenario as an example. Let's suppose a Black teen from the inner city, he's low-income family, steals a t-shirt from a store. Okay, same store, white kid, teenager from affluent parents, politically connected, steals a t-shirt from the store. Do you really believe that they're going to receive the same justice under the law? If you do, you're very naive. Former Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "If a man is a minority of one, we lock him up." Behaviors are often defined as deviant at one time in society, but later on not defined as deviant. For example, in the 1960s, when rock and roll came on the scene with Elvis and Little Richard, critics claimed it undermined morality. Well, there actually is a video I show in my 60s class, and it shows ministers taking 45 records with Elvis and Little Richard, just breaking them on the podium, and others saying, "No, this will be no rock and roll, it's the devil's own music." Well, today, rock and roll is mainstream, and of course we know it undermines morality. Okay, moving on. On page 261 is a table that summarizes the 3 paradigms explanations of deviance. So, I've always been recommending look at these tables. They give you a quick overview of how they compare the different paradigms. So we're going to begin, as we always do, with the structural functional analysis, which is found on page 251. The key sociologist here is Emil Durkheim. He said we are moral beings to the extent that we are social beings. Okay, so again, this gets back to if you were the only person in the world, you could do anything you want without any concern about how it impacts on others. But you're not the only person in the world. And so everything we do may have an impact on others. And so part of being a social being is to consider the moral implications of what we do and how it can affect others. For example, one of the ethical theories is the ethics of rights. So the ethics of rights says that people have certain rights that they hold. So for example, suppose I have the right to life, which I do. Now, in order for me to have the right to life, right observers, I'm the right holder, right observers have to not kill me. So the ethics of rights includes what right observers have to do in order to maintain the rights of right holders. So again, he says we are moral beings to the extent that we are social beings. He theorized that deviance is not abnormal because without it, society could not exist. Well, why? Number one, deviance affirms cultural values and norms. As moral beings, we prefer some attitudes and behaviors to others. But there can be no good without evil and no justice without crime. So deviance is needed to define and support morality. Okay, so again, what is that yin-yang symbol refer to? This is the plane of relativity. Everything has its opposite, and necessarily so. You can't have up without down. You can't have left without right. You can't have good without bad. Now, as soon as society determines, well, this is good, typically because that's what maintains the society, then you automatically know what's bad when you don't do it or you do the opposite. So good and bad are just totally subjective, and society just makes it all up. The best part is we like to think it stays over time, like, oh yes, this is a continuous standard. No, it's not. It changes over time as well too, but it's totally subjective. We make the whole thing up. Nothing comes down with a sign hanging on it from heaven saying this is good and this is bad. Number 2, responding to deviance clarifies moral boundaries. It sets the boundaries for what is right or good in society, as well as what is wrong or bad in society, and then we act accordingly and reinforce those boundaries. Samuel Butler said, the function of vice is to keep virtue within reasonable bounds. Okay, I got a quote from Winston Churchill, just as a review. Remember, World War II, wore top hat, smoked cigars, prime minister, party animal. A lot of people didn't know that about him, but he was. He said, he has all the virtues I dislike and none of the vices I so admire. My kind of guy. 3, responding to deviance brings people together. People typically react to serious deviance like 9/11 with shared outrage. In doing so, people reaffirm the moral ties that bind them. 4, deviance encourages social change. Deviant people push a society's moral boundaries, suggesting alternatives to the status quo, and thereby they encourage change. Durkheim said, contrary to current ideas, the criminal no longer seems a totally unsociable being, a sort of parasitic element, a strange and unassimilable body introduced in the midst of society. No, on the contrary, the criminal plays a definite role in social life. I'm going to go for another Mark Twain. He said, let us be thankful for the fools, but for them, the rest of us could not succeed. Okay, let me try to explain that one. So you're driving down the highway and somebody cuts you off. And what do you yell? Asshole. Well, you give them the we're number one sign. Yeah, okay. Well, thank God for the assholes because it makes you feel better about yourself. See, that person's the asshole. You're not the asshole, right? Until you cut somebody off, and then it's your turn to be the asshole to make somebody else feel better about herself. Hence, Mark Twain says, let us be thankful for the fools, but for them, the rest of us could not succeed. In the text, Erickson's study of Puritanism is discussed. Remember the Puritans, the Pilgrims, very pious, very religious, or so we're led to believe, very disciplined in the religious followings, and in the religious followings and in their behaviors. So they were a disciplined and highly religious group, but they too had deviance. Erickson estimated that 3 to 4% at any given time were deviant. Interestingly, similar to the United States today, with approximately 3% of adults in prison or parole or on probation. H.L. Mencken said, Puritanism is the lurking fear that someone somewhere may be happy. Yeah, we wouldn't want that. Within structural functionalism is Merton's strain theory. That it can be found on page 252. Also explained through figure 10-1. Merton says that some types of deviance may arise from the fact that the goals encouraged by a society's culture are not accessible to some people within that culture. In other words, the cultural means are not available to everyone to achieve desirable cultural goals. They lack the necessary opportunities, which results in social strain, which he said is the frustrating gap between success and their current status. Okay, so a great example would be low-income folks perhaps living, maybe 4 families living on half an acre or a quarter of an acre somewhere in the hills of Appalachia. So Almost everybody's got a TV. We may not have anything else, but we got a TV, because how else will we know how to live? So everybody's watching TV. And what's on TV? It's the lifestyles of the rich and famous. It's check my crib out. It's celebrating affluence, right? And so, we actually believe that the rich are somehow better than us simply because they're rich. Anyway, so you are living in this chicken shack house, and you see how other people are living, and you want to live like that too. But you don't have the cultural means, meaning the money, to achieve that lifestyle that everybody in America says is the American dream. So you feel this frustrating gap, this social strain. So people who are lacking or have limited opportunities, those on the social margin, like on the margin of a paper, will respond by using deviant means to achieve success. Now, when he says deviant means, he said they become innovative. So one way to be innovative is rob a bank. Then suddenly you'll have more money. Or people may be desperate enough, and have been, and understandably so, to steal food. Is this new? No. Rene Descartes in 1641 said, never put Descartes before de horse. Actually, he said, in this life, one frequently finds greater rewards for vice than for virtue. Think about it. Think about how much drug dealers make compared to if they were working at McDonald's. Merton says one could also respond with ritualism. In other words, when you feel this gap, this frustrating gap, when you feel this social strain, you could respond, instead of being innovative, you could respond with ritualism, where you have compulsive conformity to cultural norms. I give you Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, like, follow the rules, neighborino. That's all you need to do, is always follow the rules. Or retreatism, the rejection of both the goals and the norms, which many hippies did back in the 60s. So they just said, okay, this society sucks. I'm just going to live out in a commune, and we'll live in our own private Idaho. Or rebellion, advocating radical alternatives to the existing social order, which is also what some other hippies did, saying, okay, we're going to change the entire social order, change the social systems, change the social institutions, because they're flawed. Carl Menninger, in The Crime of Punishment, said, the inescapable conclusion is that society secretly wants crime and needs crime. Oh, it's so true. Look at all the different variations on CSI or the Cops show, which I think they finally took it off the air, Cops show, because it celebrated the cops. And now we're seeing some of the things that some of the cops do are not to be celebrated. What else? The Sopranos. Look how popular The Sopranos is. The Godfather series. We love crime. It's like voyeuristically, are we these criminals? All righty. Well, the critical evaluation of the structural functional analysis is on page 253. But let me begin with a quote from Oscar Wilde. He said, it is better to be beautiful than to be good, but it is better to be good than to be ugly. You got a point. Knowing the functions of deviance is valuable. Back to the critical eval. Knowing the functions of deviance is valuable, but there's evidence that a community does not always come together over crime. Sometimes fear of crime causes people to withdraw from public life. For example, look at how many elderly live in Florida in gated communities. Now, see, unbeknownst to them, the gated communities are not to keep criminals out, it's to keep the elderly in and off the highways. 2, Merton's strain theory explains some form of deviance, like stealing, better than others. For example, crimes of passion or mental illness. Crimes of passion are, okay, all too typical scenario. Guy goes home, sees a significant other in bed with somebody else, gets a shotgun, blows them both away, and then kills himself. Crime of passion. You don't even think about it. It's just you react in the heat of the moment. That's why I always chuckle about how capital punishment is touted as a deterrent. Do you think in that moment that person's thinking about, oh my God, this is a state that has capital punishment, I better not do this? No, not in a crime of passion. They're just going to do it. Also, not everyone seeks success in the conventional terms of wealth, as strain theory suggests. Although it's really interesting because if you ask people what constitutes success in life, most people will tell you it's the accumulation of possessions. Um, but that's not everybody's definition of success. I would also point out, what religion ever told you that the accumulation of possessions was constituting success in life? But hey, in our materialistic society, we bought the farm. I came across a quote by a Buddhist monk who said that trying to achieve inner peace and happiness through the accumulation of material possessions is like wrapping sandwiches around your body when you're hungry. 3, the structural functional argument that deviance reflects the opportunity structure of society has been confirmed by research. However, the structural functional assumption that everyone shares the same cultural standards for judging right and wrong is flawed. So, for example, we could all agree it's wrong to speed on the highways, but I'll bet many of us have done it anyway. Also, if crime is only defined to include burglary and auto theft, then only low-income people are criminals. We are now also defining crime to include Wall Street fraud, so high-income people are also criminals. 4, all structural functional theories suggest that everyone who breaks important rules will be labeled deviant. But it's not that simple. It's a highly complex process. Which leads us on page 254 to symbolic interaction analysis, labeling theory. Symbolic interaction explains how people define deviance in everyday situations. So definitions of deviance and conformity are highly flexible. Once again, symbolic interaction is about the social construction of reality, how we create reality by our interactions with one another. Labeling theory, like the word label, the idea that deviance and conformity result not so much from what people do as from how others respond to those actions. Dylan Thomas said, an alcoholic is someone you don't like who drinks just as much as you do. See, that was to bring out that point. Stigma is from the Greek word that means tattoo. So to be stigmatized is to have a tattoo. It's a powerful negative social label that radically changes a person's social identity and self-concept. It acts as a master status, overpowering all other forms of a person's social identity. Now, I hope you still remember master status. Like, think again, Maynard, that was last exam. We're done with that theory. Fine, fine, fine. Okay, let me give you one of my favorite examples of labeling and how it can have different impacts on people's lives and how subjective the labeling process is. Many years ago, this occurred within a few months of each other. 2 events happened. One is Magic Johnson announced to the public that he has HIV/AIDS, and Pee Wee Herman, you may remember from Pee Wee's Big Adventure and Pee Wee's Playhouse. Pee Wee's Playhouse was an awesome show. I watched it every week, Pee Wee's Playhouse. It was hilarious. It had all kinds of double entendres. So, for example, when he would make some jokes, it had one meaning for the kids and it had another meaning for the adults. So, for example, he and Cowboy Curtis are sitting around a campfire and they're eating hot dogs. And he says to Cowboy Curtis, says, "Hey, Cowboy Curtis, how's your wiener?" And he says, "Well, my wiener's fine. How's yours?" See, it's 2 different levels of me. The first one to do this that I used to watch when I was a kid was Soupy Sales. Soupy Sales had a show that came out of, I think it was Detroit, and he would have all these double entendres, so adults love watching the show too. And one day Soupy, in fact, not one day, it was New Year's Day, Soupy show's on, and we kids are watching the show, and Soupy says, "Now listen," he said, your parents are probably still sleeping. So what I want you to do is you sneak into their room real quietly and you reach in mommy's purse and daddy's pockets and pull out those funny green papers and send them to Soupy Sales, and has his address and everything. And thousands of dollars were sent into Soupy Sales and they took him off the air. You know, he donated all to charity, but come on, it's hilarious. Okay, so Pee Wee Herman one day goes to an adult theater and does whatever the heck people do in an adult theater. And the public finds out and they go, that's it. He can no longer run a kids show. He's in an adult theater. What has it got to do with running a kids show? It's not like he went to a playground and revealed himself or anything. He was in an adult theater. You know, had he rented porn, he would have been fine. Or had he watched porn on the computer or your phone, no problem. But no, he went to an adult theater, so he's off the air. And that destroyed his career for years. Only in the last couple of years as he clawed back again to try to make something of what was once a thriving career in Hollywood. Okay, here's Magic Johnson, and he announces to the world that he has HIV/AIDS. Oh my gosh, poor Magic. Well, why does he announce it to the world? Because in his own words, he didn't say this when he announced it, but in his own words, he accommodated over 1,500 women in his time. And so any one of them, hundreds of them could have AIDS. So this public announcement was his way of saying to them, hey, baby, you may have AIDS. I don't even know who you are anymore, but you better get checked. And he's a freaking hero. Again, all has to do with labeling and the impacts it can have. So it's not so much what they did, it's what we made of what they did that matters. Labeling theory casts doubt on that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Members of our society recognize the power of labels in libel law. Here's another example in academia. William Misner said, if you steal from an author, it's plagiarism. If you steal from many, it's called research. An addict is someone who hates a behavior, an addict is someone who hides a behavior. A recovering addict is someone who can't stop talking about it. Social observations. Okay. Regarding labeling, a famous study done it was the name of the article about the research was called Being Sane in Insane Places. And what happened is the authors of the study had one of the authors pretend that he was nuts. And 3 different psychiatrists examined this guy and said, yep, you're nuts, all right. And he was so nuts, they felt they had to commit him to, at the time, mental hospitals were prevalent in society, and put him in a mental hospital. And his friends had to go there and rescue him and say, he's not nuts. You guys don't even know what you're doing. You know, you can't tell sanity from insanity, but you think you can. Anyway, you know, we used to have students at the state hospital here in Allentown, and whenever I'd visit, boy, the first thing I did was put on a label that, an identifier that said Maynard, visitor. Because I figured once I open my mouth, I may never leave. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, some 15% of Americans are mentally ill at any one time, and 80% of us will suffer from some mental illness at some time in our lives. That's right. Most of us will suffer from some mental illness. So if it hasn't happened to you yet, it's coming, and boy, is it a rush. You'll see. Well, you look back on it, you go, whoa, I was freaking nuts when I was doing that. Yeah. Welcome to the crowd. The medicalization of deviance is the transformation of moral and legal issues into medical matters. So some people don't realize alcoholics, people with alcohol addiction, used to be locked up in jail. You know, they go, oh, it's a medical problem. Heaven's sakes, what the heck were you thinking about? Yeah, so then why do we lock up drug addicts? Isn't that also a medical issue? Okay, next we get to Hershey's control theory, one of my favorites. Social control depends on people anticipating the consequences of their behavior, he says. It flips the thinking around about deviance. He assumes that everyone finds at least some deviance tempting, right? So the idea here is all the other theories of deviance going, tish, tish, tish. Why should people actually do things that are bad? Why won't we all behave? We have to explain this in some way. Hershey says, are you kidding? That's not the point. It's just the opposite. He said, people just want to do what they want to do. They want to be spontaneous. And so it's not deviance that has to be explained. It's why would anybody bother to behave, right? Okay, think about it when you're growing up. You were just spontaneous. You were a kid, you just did whatever you felt like doing, right? Just like, one of my theories as to why The Simpsons is watched all around the world, one of the most universally watched comedies, which defies the theory we talked about before, where comedy is specific to a culture. The Simpsons are watched around the world. Why? Because I think it's Homer. We all wish we were Homer. Homer is totally spontaneous, just like we were when we were kids. But see, when we grew up, we learned the magic word no. And so here's everything we want to do. Woo, you can do anything you want. And your parents say, no, 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 no. And now your world is this because you've been, what you can't do has been framed by no. The boundaries have been set. Let me give you some examples. Oscar Wilde said, I can resist everything except temptation. Ruth Gordon in the movie Harold and Maude said, you don't want to be too moral. You miss too much living. Mae West. Oh, Mae West. Mae West appeared in many comedies with W.C. Fields. And Mae West was always the femme fatale and always played W.C. Fields in these movies. And she was this big, tall, buxom beauty, intelligent as heck, as you find out more about her, and a real trailblazer in Hollywood as a feminist. But anyway, she in this one movie, it's a cowboy movie, right? At least that's the setting. And so she's standing there and she's gussied up and she has a real snarky attitude and she's twirling her umbrella around and some cowboy comes up to her and is giving her the elevator look like, and she looks him over and she says, so is that a banana in your pocket or you just glad to see me? And I'm thinking that was pretty spicy for the 1940s, but anyway. She also said, between two evils, I always choose the one I've never tried before. I think, how do you meet women like this? Orson Welles said, I'm not saying we ought to misbehave, but we ought to at least look as if we could. And Peter Berger, the sociologist, said, if you're good for nothing else, you can serve as a bad example. That reminds me of, we used to have a thing here, career planning put on called Dress for Success, getting seniors ready to go out into the job world. And they'd often ask me to appear as the example of how not to dress. So I was a bad example to help everybody else understand how to dress properly. Nobody ever accused me of being a slave to fashion. Hershey points out that the reactions of family and friends or the thought of a ruined career control us from breaking rules. Ruined career, too late for that, for me. Conversely, those who feel they have little to lose by deviance are likely to become rule breakers. Well, the critique of labeling theory appears on page 256. But let me give you another example of labeling. As pot is redefined from illegal drug to medicine, the user becomes a patient and the dealer becomes a caregiver. All right, critique of labeling theory. Again, it's on page 256. Number one, because it takes a highly relative subjective view of deviance, labeling theory ignores the fact that some kinds of behaviors, like murder, are condemned nearly everywhere. Thus, it's most useful with less serious issues like mental illness. And again, that whole mental illness thing is what constitutes normality. It's a very elusive concept. Is it possible that all human behavior falls within the realm of normality and we're arbitrarily labeling certain things as crazy. 2, research on the consequences of deviant labeling does not clearly show whether deviant labeling produces further deviance or discourages it. And 3, not everyone resists being labeled deviant. Some people actually seek it out. For example, people practicing civil disobedience, many times their purpose is to get arrested to make a point. So they don't mind, they're trying to be arrested. Or back in the 60s, many of us hippies referred to ourselves as freaks. That's right, we're freaks because we're not like you, following all these rules in society and living this bland life you live. A key point is the origin of deviance lies more in the reaction of other people than in the action itself. On page 257, we get to the third paradigm, the social conflict analysis of deviance, deviance and power, deviance and inequality. So under the social conflict purview, this is on page 257, deviants are typically those who lack power in society. So here we begin with the golden rule, and I'm sure most of you know what the golden rule is, yes? Those who have the gold make the rules. The rich and powerful in any society create the norms and laws, argue the social conflict theorists. 2, the powerful also have the resources to resist deviant labels. And 3, we are not always aware of the political character of laws because of the widespread beliefs that norms and laws are just natural. The laws themselves may be inherently unfair. Well, so much so that Peter Berger said the fundamental sociological problem is not crime, but the law. Okay, great example. I already gave you one with the alcohol, with people who had suffered from alcoholism. They used to be jailed, right? And so it's considered a crime. And we say, well, that's not a crime anymore. Okay, well then all of a sudden they're not criminals because the law no longer defined that as a crime. The same thing is happening with marijuana. As it becomes legalized, what was once an illegal act, the law changes. Now no longer is someone who smokes pot doing something illegal or is a criminal. On page 257 is deviance and capitalism, which you need to know for the exam. This analysis is explained more in detail through Spitzer's theory. He argues that deviant labels are applied to people who impede the operation of capitalism. Well, how? Number 1, those who threaten the private property of others, which is fundamental to capitalism, are labeled as deviant. Conversely, when the rich threaten the property of the poor, they are rarely held accountable. So, for example, some years ago, it may occur to me what it was called, but there was a Supreme Court decision, I believe it was in the Hartford, Connecticut area, and the essence of the decision was, let's start off with what's eminent domain. Eminent domain is if the government is going to build a superhighway in your backyard, you're going to have to give up your land. Now, they'll give you fair market price, probably more than fair market price, but you got to give it up and move out. Because why? It's because the theory is anything that's declared eminent domain so benefits the public, in this case, an interstate highway, transportation, moves goods, services, and so forth, that it's a reasonable thing to ask you to have to give up your private property. Okay, but here's another example. In downtown Allentown, well, give me the Supreme Court decision, first of all. What happened is a developer wanted to use some land that was occupied by mom and pop stores, little private businesses. And he said, no. What I want to do is I want this to be declared eminent domain by the state, because if we rip out all these mom and pop businesses, I'll put in a strip mall there that's going to bring in more tax dollars. And they actually did that. Right? Like, that's not a use of eminent domain. That's just a scam, to get somebody rich, because for the developer to make more money. In downtown Allentown, which is a special tax zone, developers have been making great use of it in expanding properties. And a lot of times small businesses had to be bought out because they wanted to build even bigger properties there. Now, having said that, these small businesses were sometimes paid double the property value of uh, what their land was worth, but nevertheless, they were forced out so that a developer could build something else to accrue that in the long run, hopefully more tax money for the state and for the county and for the city of Allentown. Two, those who cannot or will not work threaten production, another fundamental of capitalism. And if you're out of work, you're a deviant. Okay, well, it's almost like when people, other than a pandemic or like the Great Recession in 2008, when people were forced out of work through no choice of their own, people get kind of almost embarrassed by being unemployed. Well, why? Because if you'll recall, I know you, that's right. Thank you. Nod your heads. Yeah, make Maynard feel better. You'll recall that we discussed, and it was part of the first exams material, is that work and activity are one of the prime American values. Work is good in and of itself. And so if you're not employed, you're not working, you're violating that value. And it's underscored by the fact that when you're unemployed, you don't get the same amount of money you got when you were working. You know, you'll get maybe half that. Why? Because the assumption is, well, my God, if we give you the same amount, you won't want to work anymore. Given some of the jobs we have, I get it. Now, that's not a universal concept because for example, Switzerland, if you become unemployed, like your company lays you off, then or I like the I like the term lets you go. What a nice euphemism. Yes, thank you so much. I've been hoping to go for years, and you finally let me go. Thank you so much. No, no, no. We fired your ass. We're just saying we let you go to make us all feel better, make us feel better about it, not you. Okay, so in Switzerland, if you were let go, the former employer has to pay your former pay for 1 year up to 90%. And then after that year is exhausted, the state kicks in and gives you 90% of your former pay, as opposed to here where you get half your pay if you're unemployed. And it's time limited. It's 13 or 26 weeks, and that's it. So when we look at unemployment numbers, that may totally undercount the number of unemployed because it only counts those still collecting unemployment. Once your time has lapsed that you can still collect, nobody knows you exist in terms of counting you as unemployed. Okay, there's also the irony of people being upset with the closing of a small town factory now owned by a multinational corporation. Okay, so let's suppose you have a family business that's been run for 70, 80 years in this small town somewhere in, I don't know, Iowa. And all of a sudden, the family decides, I don't know if we can keep this going. It's very difficult, but we're going to keep doing it because every business in town is dependent on us. So half the people in town work here, and all the other businesses depend on that income from this main company to take care of the barbers, the restaurants, and all the other services, cleaners, all the other services provided here. Anyway, so a big multinational corporation decides, okay, we're going to buy you out and we're going to disassemble the company effectively, because sometimes they make more money selling off the company than they actually do by keeping it going. So the intent was never to keep the company going, just sell off its components. Well, here's what we're going to do, the multinational. We're going to still produce what you folks produced here in Iowa, but we're going to produce it in Mexico because there we only have to pay workers about $2.80 an hour, and we're not going to have to pay you $18 an hour anymore. And so that's the way it is. And you have no legal recourse to stop it. And so basically, I think it's 60 days notice, maybe even shorter than that, maybe 30 days. I don't remember off the top of my head. But basically what the corporation says to you, hey, everybody who lives in this town in Iowa for 70 years and have been happy, get this, we're closing down the company and your life as you once knew it is over. Figure it out. There's nothing you can do about it because there ain't no democracy in the workplace. 3, those who resist authority or lack respect for authority figures and oppose the system are labeled deviant. And this is all in my book, Everything You Ever Needed to Learn. You could have learned from classic rock. John Mellencamp said, I fight authority. Authority, I always will. Reminds me of the 60s, where a popular saying was question authority. 4, those who undermine or challenge the capitalist system are subject to deviant labeling. So, for example, every time the economic powers, the 8 economic powers have a meeting somewhere, there will be protesters outside, battling capitalism and the inequality it generates and how it favors the rich and every other criticism they have about capitalism. Give you another example. The right to free speech and progress is highly valued, except when you're critical of the system itself, and then one is frequently labeled deviant. Boy, do I remember this from the 1960s. It's kind of interesting because what the 60s was all about was trying to get America to live up to its own ideals. So think about the movements in the 60s where there are inequalities with women, minorities, Native Americans. And so many of those actions say, look, you talk about equality as an ideal of America and look at how we're practicing it. And so it was just trying to get America to live up to its ideals. But in battling America about that and in protesting, we were labeled deviant. People would say frequently, if you don't love America, leave it. You so don't get the point here. We're trying to get America, we love America. We're trying to get America to live up to its ideals. John Stuart Mill, in his book On Liberty, which is written around the time of the Revolution, one of the inspirations for the American Revolution, said, if only one person were of a contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. Within the social conflict theory is the race conflict theory, which gets into hate crimes, which we've been seeing all too often in the last several years. Actually, hate crimes and police interactions, white police interactions with Black people go back hundreds of 100 years here in America, in northern cities and obviously in the South. Hate crime is a criminal act against a person or a person's property by an offender motivated by racial or other bias. Every year, the FBI compiles hate crime statistics, which are available to the public to see, and you can see how many crimes were committed against what categories of people, both property crimes and physical crimes. Feminist theory, deviance and gender. Globally, gender role guidelines have historically cost women subordinate roles have cast women in subordinate roles to men. Thus, when women express behaviors to achieve equality or step out of these gender role guidelines, they are labeled as deviant. Yes, just be a passive woman and don't make waves. Okay, on page 261 is the critical evaluation of the social conflict analysis. Again, as you saw from the first exam, many of the questions are also on the evaluation of each paradigm's application of particular subject matter. The social conflict theory posits that the criminal justice and social welfare systems act as agents of social control. Social control are attempts by society to regulate people's lives and behaviors. The idea being to control categories of people who somehow threaten the capitalist system. It implies that laws are created exclusively by the rich and powerful, which is an oversimplification. Laws are on the books to protect workers, the environment, and consumers. And some laws oppose the interests of the rich. Not a lot, but some. 2, social conflict theorists suggest that crime arises when a society treats its members unequally through capitalism. However, as Durkheim noted, deviance exists in all societies regardless of the type of economic system. Again, going back to Marx, the social conflict view is an indictment of capitalism. And so sometimes a shortcoming of the social conflict point of view is, yeah, but some of this is also true in non-capitalist societies. Actually, there is no society in the world that is purely capitalist, and there's no society in the world that's purely socialist. All economic systems, including ours, are part socialist, part capitalist. All righty. Page 264, crime and global perspective. How does the United States stack up with its level of crime compared to other countries? The foremost theorist, and this is a guy named Elliot Curry, he said, in the severity of its crime rates, the U.S. more closely resembles the most volatile countries of the third world than other developed Western societies. To give you an example, the U.S. violent crime rate is 5 times that greater than Europe. According to the Foreign Ministry of Japan, Japanese nationals are 6 times more likely to be victims of homicide while in the United States than while in Japan. That's right, man. We are scary. When I travel in Europe, people say, man, is everybody packing guns there and bullets are flying? Oh, yeah. It's like the Wild West here, packing heat and showing up at rallies with guns and AK-47s and so forth in order to keep the peace. Excuse me. In the world, there are 1.6 million violent deaths each year, half by suicide. Okay, think about it. Yet another indictment on the fact that we have an insane society, an insane planet. Half of the deaths are by suicide. There's a suicide every 40 seconds, a murder every 60 seconds, and a death in war every 100 seconds, even as I speak. Curry believes that the high rate of crime in the United States is due to, number one, our emphasis on economic success, which all too frequently comes at the expense of families. One study found that 70% of violent criminals grew up without fathers in the home. 2, economic inequality is higher in the United States than in any other Western industrial or post-industrial society. This is compounded by the enormous social diversity in the U.S. to create a relatively weak social fabric with frustrated have-nots generating widespread crime, which is just exactly what Merton described with strain theory. So what the argument here is, if we had one religion, for example, the Amish, it's easy to understand what the rules are because they're all linked to religion. And so you just follow those precepts. But we are the most religiously diverse society in the world, and we don't have a common religion to define what constitutes moral behavior. And so as a result, the argument is we have a relatively weak social fabric because we don't have that one set of religious rules to bind us all and guide our behaviors and not commit crimes. In the year 2000, a town in Oregon began fining parents for their children's misbehavior, which within a year pushed the local crime rate down by 44%. Well, why? Because a significant amount of crime is committed by young people. People between the ages of 15 to 24 represent just 14% of the US population, but account for almost 36% of all arrests for violent crimes and 41% of arrests for property crimes. 3, another contributing factor to violence in the US, according to Curry, is extensive private ownership of guns. As is noted in your text, 72% of murder victims in the US die from shootings. A recent study found that 36% of US adults either own a firearm personally or live with someone who does. That's the lowest rate of gun ownership since 1978, yet gun purchases are at an all-time high. Why? Because existing gun owners are stocking up. They can't have too many guns. The average gun owner now has about 8 firearms, double the number in the 1990s, and 1 in 5 gun owners own 10 guns or more. Now, I get it. Some of these are collectors, but others are stocking up, waiting for the final showdown. Another study found that half of the nation's firearms belong to just 3% of US adults. You know, even more disturbingly, an interesting social commentary is that whenever there's another mass shooting or a school shooting, a horrendous event like that, gun sales go up immediately. In fact, there are people who play the stock market who bank on that. As soon as they see something like that takes place, a massacre like that, they immediately buy stock in Remington or some of the other firearms manufacturer, because the sales will be through the roof, as they are currently because of the protests in the streets. Now, why is because the concern is every time there's another mass shooting is maybe this time the government will finally clamp down and pass some reasonable rules on who can own guns. When I say reasonable rules, as are passed in every other post-industrial society but ours. Why? It's because of the Second Amendment. No other society has a rule that says gun ownership is a right under the Constitution. My favorite is when people actually argue that it's a God-given right. Yeah, that God of peace and love always encouraged gun ownership. It's in the Bible somewhere. Florida and Texas have the highest gun ownership at 60% of people having guns. Florida, I get it because the elderly probably scared the hell. And in Texas, it's because, think about it, Texas, think about those old cowboy movies. You know, in Texas, it's still a legal reason to kill somebody because he needed killing. All right. Hey, let me end with some discussion about the criminal justice system and capital punishment. Capital punishment to me is just barbaric. Do you know we are the only post-industrial society in the world that still practices capital punishment? So Russia does not have capital punishment. So, you know, a lot of countries look at us and go, what is it with you people? Anyway, and again, not every state in the United States practices capital punishment either. For years, there's been a suspension of capital punishment in many states, including Pennsylvania, because more and more studies found that too many people who were being executed were actually innocent. I'm not saying everybody, but too many were. Hence, that's the whole focus of what's called the Innocence Project. Also, this is a fact that disproportionately Black people were on death row, disproportionate to their population. And so one of the courts even found, I think it was in Georgia, that that was the case. And they said, but we don't know what the remedy is. Like, what would you do then? Take all the people on death row and release enough Black people so that you have only a number of Black people that are proportionate to the population. But it speaks to the fact that the criminal justice system is clearly prejudiced against Black people. Every statistic shows this. One of my favorites is, I'm going to be more generous because I've seen two different studies. So I'm going to say it's 36%, but I've seen other studies say it's 50%. Of all crimes committed by white and Black people, same crimes, 36% of the time and as much as 50% of the time, Black people get more jail time than do the white people for committing the exact same crime. And that's just one example. We're not even getting into all the other examples of what's happening with some of the police, white police, in terms of their actions against Blacks, and the whole purpose of the criminal justice, of the police, the white police in the northern cities, starting around 1900, Blacks decided that sharecropping wasn't a real good deal in the South, so they began to move into the industrial cities of the North to find jobs because industrialization was booming. There was a time at which, for example, Philadelphia and New York, the biggest percentage of their population were Black people moving up from the South. Chicago was another example. And so what happened is these cities had what's called de facto segregation. In other words, in fact. So in the South, the segregation that existed into the 60s was obvious and blatant, where you had the colored water fountain, the white water fountain. Water was the same, but nevertheless, the bus station had the colored waiting room, and then there was the white waiting room under this separate but equal myth. Anyway, in the North, it was more subtle, or at least seemed that way. And so what happened is parts of the city were carefully segregated, that here's where Black people can live, and blacks weren't allowed anywhere else. And this was enforced by subtle and not so subtle means of what's called redlining, whereby insurance and mortgages were not given out to people who were black in certain parts of the community. And so therefore they couldn't live there. Or if you're a real estate agent and a black family's interested in property, you only showed them properties in black neighborhoods, not in white neighborhoods. Anyway, what was the function of the white police at that time is to constrain the blacks, keep them in these segregated areas. So there's been this dynamic tension between black people and the police for 100 years, over 100 years in America. And a lot of what you see happening now is just a continuous extension of that tension that has never gone away, because we've never come to grips with the fact that the white police and the criminal justice system has been trying to contain black people. Okay, so here's the problem I have with capital punishment, or even what we do with jails. So we take somebody and it's enough that you committed a crime. You know, the most sacred thing to a person is freedom. And here's a quote from the rock and roll band The who said, "Freedom tastes of reality." Okay, so when you don't have freedom, you've taken away the most fundamental thing in your life. You're going to be locked in prison. Okay, that would be enough, wouldn't it? But no, 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 no. We take it to the next measure. We actually put you in a cage like an animal. Put you in a cage with another person, or maybe two other people or three other people. You were locked in a cage. And yeah, you get out and you have recreation and go, but the point is you sleep in a cage at night. Have you ever gone to a zoo and watched the animals who are in cages, like the lions and so forth? They're pacing back and forth because they have become neurotic. They're crazy from living in a cage. It's not natural. And then they say, well, they can't have a gym. They can't have a TV. No, 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 folks, relax. It's enough that they're restrained from society, that their freedom is taken away from them. We don't have to go the extra measure by setting up a situation in the jails where that we have to add to the punishment. The punishment was going to jail. It's enough. Okay, how successful is it in terms of rehabilitation? Not really successful. In Pennsylvania, the recidivism rate is about 60-some%. That means people who are released from jail 66% of the time go back to jail again. Why? Partly because they're labeled ex-con and can't get work. So now there's lots of programs to try to help somebody get a job. It's like, well, I can't hire him. He's an ex-con. He might steal. No, I didn't steal. I killed people. Just kidding. But the point is, you know, how are you supposed to get a new start in life if you don't get an opportunity to do it? Now, the other thing about putting people in cages is, you may recall when we were talking about democratizing the workplace, one of the supervisors observed that when you treat people like adults, 95% act like adults. Wow, really? Well, when you treat people like animals and put them in cages, how do you expect they're going to act when we're released? When they're released, and then we go, oh my God, they act like animals, some of them. What did you expect? Okay, so and that's supposed to rehab you. And it does for some people, it absolutely does. And for others, it just, you know, it's like going to prisons, like going to crime school. Okay, see, the reason why you're arrested is you didn't know how to do this. This is how you have to do it. And next time it'll take longer for you to get arrested. Okay, what would be the alternative? Let's suppose one of the arguments about capital punishment is it brings peace to the family of the bereaved, the person who was murdered. It does for some people, but not for others. And so that's not something that's endemic to what it is to be a human being. It's not human nature. It's kind of learned behavior. I can remember a great example is when some years ago in Pennsylvania, a guy broke into an Amish school and shot many of the kids. And there's a great video we own called Forgiveness. And the question is, how do you family members achieve forgiveness? And they said, well, you know, we follow religious principles, and Every day is another day to have to practice forgiveness. It's hard when you lose a child. But they insisted that this person not receive capital punishment because they said, how is that going to make it right? We don't need that person to be executed to make us feel better. So not everybody believes that, even though that's the popular thing. So when the person's being executed because the federal government under the Trump administration has resumed executions, they have that person strapped on a gurney and they're getting ready to inject them. And then all of a sudden the curtains part and there's the family of the loved one, watching the execution. That's really barbaric to me, but hey, anyway, what would be an alternative? Well, if you really want to give that person peace and perhaps rehabilitate this person who committed the murder, why not have a member of the family or the family visit with this person once a month and explain to this person what his or her actions, what consequences it had for the family, how it makes them feel. Because many times when people are have their final say in the courtroom, they do apologize to the family and all that. Yeah. And maybe it's sincere, I don't know. But the point is, now every month we're going to come in and visit with you and tell you how this is impacting on us. That might be a real chance for rehabilitation. Okay, in terms of how it works around the rest of the world, the total number of federal, state, county, and local prisoners has ballooned from 320,000 in 1980 to 2.4 million today, and taxpayers spend more than $80 billion a year to keep all these people locked up. Recidivism rates are appallingly high. About 40% of inmates are African American, way disproportionate to their population in the United States. These troubling facts give rise to a de-incarceration movement that has brought together both liberals and conservatives who want better, cheaper, more effective ways of dealing with people who commit crimes. The idea that we lock people up, throw them away forever, never give them a second chance of redemption is not what America is about, says Republican former governor, Texas Governor Rick Perry. Do prisons work? That's debatable. It's true that as the incarceration rate has rocketed upward over 25 years, violent crime has plunged. The lesson seems clear. The more murders and rapists you have in jail, the fewer murders and rapes you're going to have. Yet criminologists have been unable to find a direct correlation between incarceration and crime levels. In New York State, for example, the city's prison population has bucked national trends to drop to its lowest level since 1990, yet its homicide, burglary, and robbery rates have also plummeted as much as 80% in the same period. After Texas adopted reforms releasing thousands of prisoners, crime dropped by 18% over 3 years. Nor is the corrections system living up to its name, corrections. 60% of inmates released from prison find themselves back behind bars within 3 years, having totally failed to reintegrate into normal society. Okay, so let me give you an example. Here's what they do in Norway. Now, it's always difficult to compare cultures because sometimes it's an apple and an orange. But nevertheless, in Norway, the focus of their prison system is on rehabilitation, not punishment. In Unit C, a building for 84 inmates, convicts share apartments and eat, cook, and work together using knives in the kitchen and power tools in the workshops. Convicts have locks on the inside of their doors for privacy. Even Norway's notorious prisoner Anders Breivik, who in 2011 killed 77 people in a bombing and gun rampage, he lives in relative luxury under his regime of particularly high security at a Illa prison near Oslo, where he's allowed 3 cells, a study, a gym, and bedroom. How does this work? Norway boasts that its 5-year recidivism rates are just 20%. Who knows? Perhaps it would work here. And you know how we'll find out? Only by trying it. You can theorize forever whether it will work or not. There's only one way to find out. Try it. Hey, everybody. Thus endeth chapter 10. I'll be back soon with another presentation on chapter 11. Take care for now.